Good morning, my name is Maximo Torero. I am the Chief Economist for FAO, and it's a pleasure to be here. I apologize I cannot be physically here, but I hope this presentation will help the learning process that you're trying to achieve through this learning event to support the development of pro-poor value chains. The presentation that I'm going to give you today tries to bring together 6 key points. And the first one will be related to the importance of impact evaluation, and especially on trying to understand how to scale up innovations that we're trying to push for development of pro-poor value chains. The second point, I will try to find ways in which we need to understand better that when we tackle value chains, we need to look at the whole value chain and not only looking at the producer or the household, but we need to look at all the elements of the value chain. This is very important because most of the value chain process today happens at the level of the urban areas and not necessarily the rural areas. So it's a mechanism in which we can create spillovers from intervention in the agricultural sector. The third element is that we need to identify properly the bottlenecks, and that's why the value chain approach is useful, because not necessarily the bottlenecks could be in the post-harvest part, in the processing part, it could be at the producer level, and therefore we can better target what types of interventions we need to implement. The fourth point is that we need to find better ways to link smallholders to dynamic markets. And one of the major constraints we face in poor countries and developing countries is that we have a huge atomization of land. And the only way we can link smallholders into markets is through aggregation. So we need to find mechanisms in which it will allow us to aggregate what they produce so that they can have the scale, the sufficient scale to be able to sell their products to dynamic markets. The fifth point is that I would like to focus on one of the major problems we have found today that still we don't have very useful solutions, which is referring to extension. And why is that? Because we have not seen yet mechanisms of extension and models of extension that are successful in all its dimensions. So we need to find ways to improve over that. And we need to find ways to release one of the major constraints that we are observing today in terms of extension, which is the capability constraint. What this means is that most of our farmers in rural areas, in poor countries, don't know how to read and write. And that means that it's very difficult for them to understand the way we transfer information to them. So we need to innovate around this and we need to find solutions. And finally, I would like to focus on how we can better target the interventions. IFAD has a clear mandate to target poor producers in areas where households are extremely poor. And that requires to have a framework of properly targeting them to be able to achieve the goals and the impacts that you are supposed to achieve. I will present some of the basic framework that we are following at FAO, which is called the Hand in Hand initiative, which I hope will help to better have a mechanism through which we can prioritize the way we target and which also can allow us to find a better way to scale up the results of what we do. Thank you. So let me start with the 6 points I will concentrate my presentation today. The idea here and the idea of the whole presentation is to find ways in which we can think differently to resolve a big problem, which is linking smallholders to dynamic markets, especially the poorest. So the first point was that we need to improve the way we measure impact, and especially to find ways in which we can scale up interventions. Why? Because this is not a simple issue, and I think IFAD has done a significant effort to try to measure impact in what they do. The best and the golden mechanism, the golden way to do evaluations today is what we call randomized controlled trials. They are very useful because we allow us to have internal validity of what we evaluate and allow us also to identify why projects work and why they didn't work. The problem is sometimes it's extremely complex to create a randomized controlled trial because of the sample size. Sometimes you will need an enormous amount of sample to be able to have some statistical power, to be able to have some inference about the potential impact. So in reality, in most of the cases, we have to move to intermediate solutions, a little bit far from the golden standard, but sometimes they are very useful and we can learn a lot from them. Those are, for example, the quasi-experimental methods that could help us and could allow us to resolve some of the internal consistency, internal validation, internal validity, and could also be more adjustable to the reality of the project. Like, let's just assume that you have a value chain and you want to randomize a value chain. That will be close to impossible. But you can do other tools like regression discontinuities and other potential metrics that will allow us to do that better. So we need to be flexible. We need to find ways in which we can do things according to the reality of what we are implementing. Now, the other topic that I refer in this first point was scalability. And this is very complex. Scalability doesn't mean that when I test something and I show that it works, assume that I do it in a very sophisticated way through the golden standard randomized controlled trials. That doesn't mean that I can scale up. That's why we refer that in randomized controlled trials, major problem is that they don't have external validity. That means that what happens in one location not necessarily will happen the same in other locations. Today, there have been some important progress in how to do that and how to find ways in which we can better scale up. But that's something that we need to think carefully. And that's where, for example, the framework I'm trying to present at the end could help and give an idea. Because if we find from the beginning a mechanism to test interventions in a framework that already is identifying commonalities in areas, like, for example, same agroecological conditions, same levels of education, of human capital development, same types of constraints in terms of what they produce and commodities, that increases the probability that what I test in one location can be scaled up to the other location. But again, I think this is an area that we need to put a lot of effort to try to improve in the future and to find ways in which we can improve the way we scale up. Because today we only have very, very light qualitative experience, and it's an area where we can learn a lot from nutrition, where they have learned how to scale up interventions. Let me now move to the second point, that we need to move from the farmer to the value chain. Why? Because the farmer that we are going to target in any intervention is linked to a value chain. The value chain could be very rudimentary and very small in the poorest of the poor farmer, but it could be a little bit more complex in farmers which are more linked to dynamic markets. We need to identify backward linkages like inputs to the farmer. We need to identify forward linkages like retailers, traders, processing, secondary processing, and distribution. That's the only way we can understand the problem of what we're trying to resolve. And again, thinking on evaluation, that's a difficult issue, but that's something that we need to move. There is no way we can do interventions if we don't look at the whole value chain and map the value chain and find where in the value chains the problems are, where we can resolve the problem and where we can tackle that. Let me just bring you a simple example. This is the case of food losses. Okay? So FAO have been designing a new methodology to measure food losses. And what we find out that we need to find different ways to measure losses, but we need to measure losses across the value chain. Typically, we only look at losses post-harvest, but a lot of the losses are happening in the pre-harvest side and not necessarily in the post-harvest side. In this graph that you can observe, for example, the orange part of the bar is referring to the level of the losses that occur at the farm level. The dark bar at the middleman and the green bar at the wholesaler level. So these are samples that we took for Ecuador, Peru, Guatemala, Honduras, Ethiopia, and China on different commodities: potato, beans, maize, teff, and wheat. And what we found is that a lot of the losses are in the pre-harvest level. Whatever methodology we use, each bar refers to a different methodology. We have the self-report methodology, the category methodology, the attribute methodology, or the price methodology. In any of the methodology we use, we identify that there is a big problem at the producer level. Why is this so important? Because it's not only the issue of the post-harvest side and the processing part, it's also the issue of how farmers are producing and how much is lost in the field and how much is lost in the pre-harvest part. And when we look in detail and we look at the reasons, for example, of the pre-harvest losses, we identify that pests, disease, and animals are one of the major sources, the yellow part of this bar. We also identify that lack of rain, which is tied and linked to climate change, for example. And we also find in some commodities that weeds are the problem. So the solutions can be customized to the problem that we are observing. And the problems vary depending on the commodity. But at least looking at the different nodes allow us to bring solutions to the problems that we are facing and not just to assume the solutions. Clearly, the case of pest disease and lack of rain could be linked to improved seeds and could also be linked to soils. Soil management reduces the number of pests and the number of problems we have in terms of diseases. And that is linked also to the use of fertilizers and the specific fertilizers that those soils need. So we need to find ways to look at that and look at the whole value chain. Third, and the third point is that we need to identify where the bottlenecks are and then implement interventions. What we are trying to do here, for example, is trying to look at the value chain in Honduras, for example, where we are trying to measure and solve a problem. The problem that we wanted to solve was basically to reduce the level of losses. And we found that the major problem of losses was linked to the topics I referred before. Now, this is an example of how I can implement a randomized control trial. I have a problem, and I have potential types of interventions. One intervention was to provide them a package of inputs like normally governments will do. The second intervention was, okay, let's assume that the government is not doing it efficiently, and let's the farmers make the solutions they need to do to be able to achieve a target. And the target will give them an incentive. So basically what we do in the second treatment is to provide them the information of what are the standards they need to produce their beans to be able to be purchased at a dynamic market, and that the size of the incentive or the additional price that they will get if they comply with those standards. But the farmers can do whatever they think is the way to do it, instead of the government giving them a pre-designed package. And then, of course, you have a control group. So this is an easy intervention because it's at the farmer level, but we know it's going to affect the whole value chain, but allow us to randomize and test if this works or not. Like, for example, if we find that the market intervention, the price incentive with the information, is the best one, that could simplify a lot the way we operate, because we don't need to provide inputs through governments and so on, which sometimes is really complex and sometimes is an open box for corruption, but will allow us also to find a market-based solution that, through the information of standards, through a clear incentive, through prices, could allow farmers to achieve better profits. And that's exactly what we found. When we did the randomized control trial, we found that the direct incentives to farmers and linking them to corporate buyers with a price premium if they comply with the standards helped to reduce 7% of the quality loss. Although the amount is still small, still there was a significant effect relative to the control group and relative to the government providing the seeds and the fertilizers. So it's important to find solutions and to find innovative ways to bring these solutions to the problems that we're facing in the value chain. Let me now find ways in which we can bring and scale up or create the aggregation needed for small farmers to link to dynamic markets. And this is my fourth message. So we need to learn from wrong policies and from wrong solutions. Sometimes we evaluate things and we only represent the successes, and we forget to present the problems. I think we need to find ways to learn from mistakes, but also from those mistakes and from the successes, we need to find ways to aggregate. And there are two ways you can aggregate. You can aggregate vertically or you can aggregate horizontally. But thinking on smallholders, if we want to link them to dynamic markets and we want to move them out of poverty, it's central that we innovate in the way we create these aggregations. And that's where we can bring ideas of vertical integration or horizontal integration through product differentiation. Small farmers will be price takers. And the only way they can negotiate better is if they have the aggregation level, the scale of the amount of produce, so that they can link to these dynamic markets. Now, one way to do this is contract farming. But we have seen, and there are many research on this, that sometimes there is a tendency from smallholders, from contractors, to move away from smallholders. And the reason is because it's very difficult to monitor how they perform and to monitor the standards. IFAD have done several projects on this, and they have tried to find innovative ways to resolve that problem. But the literature is really big on showing all the potential problems because of the incapacity to monitor significant number of smallholders. The second problem, assume that we can resolve the monitoring through different mechanisms, is the problem to the producer that accepts the contract. Sometimes the company that does the contract with this producer won't comply with the conditions that they agree. And in the report of IFAD, in terms of the evaluation of what is being done in IFAD, you find several cases in which, for example, they were able to agree to a price with the contractee, with the company, but not necessarily that price is what is being paid at the end, because the company will argue different things that doesn't allow them to pay the price that they commit to. And this is because the farmer is in a hold-up situation. Once they agree to do this contract, they have to deliver the produce to this company, because normally the company will put some specific ties to assure that the product is being delivered. And that's where the company could have some monopoly power, no? So one buyer for that commodity. Now, this is a problem that happens both in the corporate side, where basically in dynamic markets, supermarkets, and export companies, they are also interested in purchasing from smallholders. So although most of the production is collected from big producers and from medium producers, as is shown in the figure, they also like to link with the smallholders, because they can find in the smallholders, especially in the high value commodities, some attributes and heterogeneity on the attributes for which they could have specific markets. Let me bring the example of mangoes. Mangoes, in the case of several countries that export mangoes, the Kent mango, for example, the market demands different caliber, size, different color of mango. And a large producer will produce an homogeneous variety or characteristics of a mango, same caliper, same color. While companies can harvest from different smallholders and get the number of kilograms of mangoes they need of different types, of different calipers, of different colors, for which they have a specific market at a very high price. So they understand that, and they think that this product differentiation could bring profits to them. The problem is how they control them and how they monitor the quality, how they monitor the standards. But exactly the same problem happens in horizontal arrangements like cooperatives or umbrella of cooperatives, where they are linking also to dynamic markets. And the organic coffee one is a huge example, where they are linking associations of producers of a lot of small holders, the green circles in the graph I'm showing. But for them, they have exactly the same problems as the big dynamic market through a corporation. So we need to bring solutions. We need to think differently. We need to think out of the box to be able to resolve that, because they also need to expand the level and the number of smallholders they have. Now, we have been testing, and FAO has a database of different designs of contracts on how to do that. For example, cost of monitoring, club formation. It comes from the microfinance literature. How we can enforce, if you want to be part of the club, you have to spend some time on monitoring others so that they comply with the standards. Abuse of monopsony power. Here, we need to develop stronger rural farmer associations and type products, for example. That's something that IFAD does a lot. Price schemes. We have to put in place in the contracts price schemes with incentives on productivity and quality. Normally, we don't do that. We fix a price, but it's not tied to a change in productivity, a change in the standards. Quality standards, joint definition of quality. We did an experiment in Vietnam on milk, and we found that the producers of milk were not investing in improving the quality of the milk they were supplying because they thought the company was cheating. So how it works in milk is that milk is brought to the collection center, the company will sample from that milk brought by the smallholder, and they will do the tests in the lab. And then the farmer will be paid based on the quality and the attributes of the milk they deliver. Farmers thought that companies were cheating in the way they test the milk, and therefore they were not happy and they were not investing in improving the productivity and the quality of milk. So we designed a mechanism in which we have third-party lab testing, like in Germany, where basically we took two samples, one for the company and one for a lab that was agreed by the company and the farmers. They had the same benchmarking, so they will test the milk relative to the same standard milk. And we provided vouchers to the farmers to execute the vouchers to see the results whenever they didn't believe what the company was reporting. What happened at the end? Just the signal of the transparency of the multiple testing make the farmers to start changing the way they produce. But when they start to execute the vouchers, they immediately found that the results were the same. And that helped to change the whole dynamic of production and productivity of the farmers. They start to invest more, and they start to improve the quality of the milk, and the company did better. And also the company figured out that they needed to automatize the testing process so it was more transparent for the farmers. So again, a simple solution creates a huge impact. The same with access to credit. Normally, the credit is given through the contract designs. So a company will say, okay, I will give you the seed, I will give you the fertilizer, and I will give them to you as a loan. But companies are not designed to do this. That's why we have the financial system. And that will give them credit history to the farmers. But we need to break the symmetry of information with the financial system to be able to give them access. And that requires information sharing. It requires reducing the risk, de-risking the operation for the bank initially until it gains knowledge on how to score the risk of the farmers so that they can give them loans. And that's what we did with what we call the double ransom model. Basically, we create a little trust fund that de-risk the operations of the financial system of a little set of banks, and they agreed to lend in their own process to these farmers. And what they found is that the farmers paid back. And we took that from the side of the contracts that the company was developing. Again, we create a big change. The farmers and the financial system start to lend more and therefore increase the scale of the lending to the banks or to the farmers relative to what the companies could have done at a smaller scale. And finally, productivity. Clear price incentives to increase in productivity. So again, innovation is central to be able to bring that and to bring that out. The fifth point, which I think is a big challenge, is how to improve on innovation of extension. We need to innovate. IFAD has worked in several models of extension. They have tested different ways to do it. I remember in Cambodia, they were testing different ways to do extension. But again, outside of evaluating them, we found that the impact was not so big. And we found that we need to innovate. because it's very difficult to monitor extension. There is an agency problem. It's very difficult to monitor the effort of the agents. No matter we use state-of-the-art technologies like digital technologies, that's not enough. We need to learn more. And we need to use IT technologies because that reduces the cost. But again, it's more than just that. And one of the major barriers, no matter I use tablets or I use videos, is a capability barrier. In the sense that most of the rural areas, especially in Africa, for example, the level of people that doesn't know how to read and write is significant. And that is what we need to find a way to resolve that. So let me just bring you an innovation that we did in Peru. What we did in Peru is we saw that there was a problem of extension, and we looked and worked with the schools. So instead of going directly to the farmers, the parents in this case, we went through the kids to influence the behavior of parents. And we create an intervention using ICT technologies, where basically we identify in the plots of the kids going to a school, because normally they work in their plots, what were the major problems they were facing. One of those, for example, was armyworm. There were also problems with the cattle. There were also problems with all the different products they were having. So we developed some little videos. This is the case of the corn earworm, where we teach the kid how to identify the problem, what they can do with the problem, and we provide them a simple solution to that problem. So for the earworm, we provide them a solution of a molasses trap. But the idea was we wanted to test how much this kit will influence the behavior of the parent and how much we will teach these practices to the parent to find a way to break the barrier of capability, because the farmer didn't know how to read and write, but the kid knows how to read and write. These were secondary school kids. So if we are able to change and the knowledge of the kid and the kid transfer that to the parent, then we were successful. We broke that barrier in an innovative way. But also the kid can do the solution himself. But the idea was how much the kid can influence the parent. What we found? We found that we were able to teach parents through the kids agricultural practices. We test that through follow-up surveys. The information is transmitted to farm managers in the household. And when the student is taught an agricultural practices, farm management knowledge of that practice increases by 6 to 9 percentage points. This is an effect of 20 to 30%. And the adoption of the practice increases between 3 to 5 percentage points, that is 16 to 23% of impact. And this is statistically significant. Again, this was a randomized controlled trial. But again, the idea is innovate. The same with cellular phones and digital technologies. The capability constraint is there, but kids know how to read and write. We can transfer messages to them and they will influence the behavior of parents. So our project, I think, is something that we can try in different locations, but it's an innovative way to try to find a solution. Let me finalize with a new concept that we are bringing up, which is how to target the interventions, how to better sequence them. And the concept we are using here is the concept of the stochastic frontier. This is a concept that we are using in an initiative of FAO called Hand in Hand. Essentially, when we do interventions, we need to identify what type of interventions we can do and where. We normally assume in rural areas agriculture is the solution for everything. But results that is not the case. There are areas in the rural sector which agriculture doesn't have any potential. There are areas where agriculture have a huge potential. So what we do here is we estimate this frontier. The yellow curved line is the production possibility frontier. Here we put milk and corn. How big is the frontier will imply how much in a specific area a producer will be able to get enough resources to move itself out of poverty. The C point is telling us how far is that farmer from that frontier. So let's look at two extreme situations. You could have a very small frontier, less than $1.90, for example, the extreme poverty line. No matter the farmer, the C is in the frontier, he will never move out of poverty. So agriculture is not a solution in that area. The other situation is where we have a very high level frontier, a lot of poverty, but the farmer is very far from that frontier. And that's why he's not in the frontier. But the frontier is a lot bigger than the poverty line, the extreme poverty line. So if I am able, through my interventions, to move that C point to the poverty line, to the frontier, I will be moving the farmer out of poverty. And that's a sustainable solution. And that's the way I think where IFAD should target its own projects. So the two situations, the green, high potential. Again, we are in the world of areas where the poverty is really high. But the green is the high potential, where we can bring productive solutions, identifying what is the reason of why the level of inefficiency, why they are not in the frontier, and the red areas, where there is no agricultural potential, Solutions there are linked to human capital, are linked to other activities not related to farm, or to be part of the value chain, but not the producer part. But there is no way, through agriculture alone, production agricultural products, you will be able to move out of poverty. We try this as an example in the case of Burkina Faso, and we classify them in several areas. So our position is the red is where there is no agricultural potential. That's where social programs, transfer human capital, or other non-farm activities or linkages to the value chain should happen. The dark green areas are areas where, although there is a lot of poverty, there is a lot of agricultural potential. If I put those farmers in the frontier, they will move out of poverty. And that's exactly what IFAD did in the South-South corridor in the case of Puno in Peru. They were successful in linking these farmers, identifying despite the levels of poverty of the location, and putting them closer to the frontier to resolving some of their bottlenecks. So that's what we need to target. The dark green areas is where we will reduce more poor by linking them to the frontier, and the red areas to minimize the potential consequences of being poor and not having access to agricultural products because the agroecological conditions are not good enough. So this is just one idea of how we can better target and also how we can better sequence interventions, because it will allow us to identify how to reduce inefficiency and what else can be happening. And imagine in this type of map, you can bring any layer over it. You can bring the roads layer, any other layer that will allow you to be able to identify how to sequence potential interventions. Now, this also helps enormously to use market segmentation, because in some of the areas, it will be very nascent and there will be a lot of constraints, so you need a lot of government intervention. But as you move up in the value chain, as you move up in terms of development of the markets, then the private sector can start to play a role, and we can have more private investment. The case of the milk that I expressed before, the government was trying to resolve this problem of asymmetry of information. But once the problem was starting to be resolved, farmers started to produce more, to grow more. And then it became more attractive for the private sector to come in. So again, we need to find ways to segment this continuous of the market so that we bring together the public and the private. We start with public in the poorest areas, with less institutions, with less capabilities, but as we move up, we can move them to attract private sector, reducing asymmetry of information for them to invest more. So thank you so much. These are some ideas, 6 points that I wanted to bring up, and I hope this presentation will be helpful for you. Thank you.